Sure.
So, hi everyone, thanks for joining the University of Manchester Young Fabians for our first policy event. We're really excited about this event because we think this topic in particular, student mental health during the pandemic, has been pretty much ignored by the entirety of the government. Student mental health has long before coronavirus, to be fair. So we've got a fantastic panel joining us this evening, each of whom will be able to make really valuable contributions. So first of all, we've got Kate Green, the Shadow Education Secretary. We've got Dr. Rosena Allin-Khan, the Shadow Minister for Mental Health. Emma Hardy, the Shadow Further Education and Universities Minister. And last but not least, we've got Kira Lewis, who's a student activist and the Disability Officer for King's College Labour. So before our panel introduces themselves, we'll provide some context to the situation. And just to give you a run through of how it's going to go. So we'll give some context, we'll give each panel member a couple of minutes to introduce themselves and say why this topic's really important, and then we'll move on to questions. So if you want to ask any questions, just pop them in the chat box.
Hi guys. As you all know, as I'm sure everyone here is aware, university students have been one of the most disrupted groups in the country during the pandemic. We find ourselves living in two different places. Moving has obviously been very restricted, and rightly so, but there's a whole host of difficulties that come with that. And often students find themselves without adequate academic support and in poor quality housing for quite extended periods of time without the support networks that often exist for other people around the country, with family and friends, whatever. The government has played lip service to the issue of student mental health, but has often not addressed it properly. And of course, all of these big things combined have had quite a big impact on student mental well-being. The Office for National Statistics, so that's the government's own report, has found that 57% of students reported a worsening of their mental health in the second half of 2020. Almost a third of students report not having left their accommodation in 7 days, even for food or exercise, and a similar number report being dissatisfied with the quality of their education. During this crisis, many universities began to publicize the support they offer their students. However, only 29% of those who reported a worsening mental health actually sought support, and of those, almost half felt the support they received was wholly inadequate. Essentially, this means that 15% of students who are suffering from poor mental health have sought support and are happy with the support. So 75% of students that have suffered with mental health haven't sought support, and if they have, haven't been satisfied with it. Yeah, Amy, I think that might be universal because I can't hear you either.
Sorry, I knew we'd have some kind of technology problem. So we've kind of painted a picture of the series of this crisis and how it's affected students. Which has largely been brought about through inaction by the government, but also through universities across the UK. So a lot of students don't seek support, and the few that do are often dissatisfied with the support that they receive. So before we move on to our panel and let them introduce themselves, if any of you guys have any questions, again, just make sure to put them in the chat.
So I think while people are adding their questions in the chat, we'll move on to allow our wonderful panel to start sharing their thoughts on this issue. So Kate Green, we'll do you first. As Shadow Education Secretary, we'd love to get your thoughts on this crisis and what you think we could be doing better or anything connected to that.
Yeah, great, thank you. It's really good that you're organising this event. In fact, we've been talking about this in the Shadow Education team and with Rosena because we really see this as an opportunity to work across our teams for quite a few weeks. So this is a really good time to be having this meeting with you and getting your ideas and input. And we know that there were already real concerns, and I'm sure Emma will say more about this, about student mental health in universities, and some initiatives that have been developed over recent years by universities and working with the NUS and with Universities UK and others to try and improve policies and practice. But obviously there were still gaps, serious gaps in provision, as I'm sure Rosena will say, as there are in every aspect of mental health services. And everything now has been massively, massively worsened by the COVID crisis. And we are really concerned, actually. We think that this is an immediate and acute problem for students who are suffering severe stress and anxiety in many cases now. But we're also very concerned about the long-term effect on this cohort of students who are living through these really extreme times, and how we make sure not just that we're arguing for support in the midst of this immediate crisis, but that it also enables people who are going through this and having their studies so disrupted and their expectation of their studies and university life so disrupted, that we are attending to long-term well-being and resilience too, because clearly this is a traumatizing event for all of us in society, but for the reasons that you've described, particularly for students isolated, not getting the university and teaching experience they expected, perhaps been away from home, perhaps been unwell when we had those spikes of COVID at the start of last term. Lots of things that, you know, put students in a particularly difficult position, have had some particularly difficult experiences. So we are certainly interested in what we can say about what core services and support should be available to students now. I'm really interested in your views and on how we can sort of build long-term resilience for students going through this pandemic now, and also how we can openly talk about this, which I think, you know, society has got better at talking about mental health, but what your view is and how students feel about talking about this, and whether we think there's also a hidden degree of mental ill health that we ought to be aware of among the student community. And for us, I think Emma, Rosena and me, we are really keen to be campaigning on all of this. So very much like to also, with the Young Fabians, think about how we could do some of that together and how we could bring more students' voices to the forefront in any campaigning that we do. So it's really good timing. Thanks for asking us.
No, thank you for coming on. I think that's something that's become quite obvious during the pandemic, that they're just not consulting students or young people at all. You know, no one in education would advocate or bring about for the kind of policies that they've introduced. So Rosena, are you able to give us your perspective as the Shadow Mental Health Minister?
Sure. Firstly, thanks so much for having us tonight. And I have great memories because I did my master's in Manchester. So, you know, I am an alum and very excited to be here. And can I just say, before I say anything more, you in Kate Green and in Emma Hardy have two people that are really fighting your corner. I have student mental, really are going into bat for you. So I'm so excited that we can all be here together tonight. Look, students have had an incredibly difficult time over the last few months. And in fact, I honestly think that they are one of the hardest hit groups and one of the least spoken about when it comes to acknowledging the difficulties with their mental health. And in fact, we all know that with students, it's not a one size fits all. There are some students who have had to suffer the whole exams fiasco, then people who were, you know, off to university thinking they were starting their new life, finding themselves in halls of residence with people they've not met, being policed by accommodation officers and being told they have to have their food delivered and they cannot leave their, you know, halls of residence, and then turning on the TV to have a government that's blaming them for a second spike. Students have had a really very difficult time. And if, like me, you needed to hold down like 4 jobs in order to pay the rent, you'll also understand that for students, it's not just about the studying aspect of your life. It's the time when you are learning so much about who you are, and you're also really anxious about how you'll be paying your tuition fees, your rent. So things like not being able to work and worrying about your own family. All of these multi-layered things have led to a perfect storm where we have found that our students have had an incredibly difficult time. And I know that Kate's mentioned this already, but what is so important to us is that we have students at the front and center of telling us what you need. I think people are really tired of having politicians talking about them with language that doesn't really relate to what they're going through, and making policy decisions on their behalf without even consulting them. And so, you know, you've had an incredibly challenging time, but I also would say that some of the resilience that I've seen come out of student groups has been incredible. And there's so much that we can learn about what has worked well and how we support each other with mental health over this time. But one of the things that we called for, Kate and myself, we had an intervention back in September when people found themselves really concerned about what was going on, is we said the government has to have a joined up strategy working with universities to be very clear on how they're going to support students' mental health. And that also includes the understanding that if you have moved from your home part of the country, finding yourself in a place that isn't home, and you're having to access mental health services, that is incredibly challenging. So we said to the government, what is your strategy for ensuring that the government is working together with universities and local NHS trusts and local accommodation providers to support students? And this is obviously ongoing because the government, being the way they are, haven't been very forthcoming or very transparent with any sort of plan. But please know that we're all going into bat and we want to hear from you. And that's why things like tonight are so important and so vital. But please also know that it doesn't end tonight. Our doors are open. You can email us, you can contact us. We want to hear from you because you are the drivers behind this. You are more powerful than you ever know you are. And we are your voice. We're ready to be here to help you. And thanks so much for having us tonight.
Thank you, Rosena. That was a fantastic contribution. Fantastic words. I think everything you said was fantastic, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the kind of focus that we tend to have on studying and academics in this issue, rather than a kind of more broader, well-rounded student, I don't want to say experience, but all of the things that come together when it comes to being a student and the different ways that even things like the furlough scheme will obviously still impact many students as well as the university issues. Emma, you are the Shadow Further Education and Universities Minister. What are your thoughts about this whole situation?
Thanks, Ben, and thanks so much for inviting me. And that was incredible, Rosena. It was always so inspiring, and from Kate as well. And you know, I have to say, when it comes to mental health, I know it sounds like we're all telling each other we're great, but Rosena really is great and really does go out there and fight the good fight. So I'm so pleased that she's here on as well. And just on the point around students having the power and students needing to be listened to, I don't want to rant too much about this government. Well, I will try. I can't make promises I can't keep, obviously. But I think it is worth noting that when the government set up the University Task Force, they excluded the NUS from being on it. So they excluded the voice of students in it. And I think through many of the mistakes and decisions that government have made, you can see how they could have made better decisions had they actually consulted with students to begin with. Because I think that that's one of the things that's been missing in Gavin Williamson's catalogue of failure. And you can understand why student mental health is suffering so much at the moment. And I just briefly scanned through some of the chat comments. And one of the biggest things coming through at the moment is the financial uncertainty. We've known for a long time that the system is broken. The Labour Party is committed to not having tuition fees, as you all know. The maintenance loans have never covered the cost of maintenance, including the cost of rent. Students have always had to rely on part-time jobs and opportunities. And throughout this pandemic, those part-time jobs and income have disappeared. So not only are students facing concerns around social isolation and feeling alone and concerned about loved ones, they've got those very real money worries as well and financial concerns. And you sort of add into this feeling of general uncertainty because the government seems incapable of planning beyond what is going to happen next week or tomorrow's headline and not looking for a long-term plan for students. And the amount of that uncertainty, of course, understandably fuels anxiety and fuels mental health concerns, because there's still no real plan for students who need to complete practical elements on their placements. What's going to happen to them? When are they going to be allowed back to use their equipment? Is there going to be a return to face-to-face teaching this year? Are students going to have the skills and knowledge needed to enter the workplace if they're graduating this year? Are employers going to compensate for any course and knowledge loss that has happened in universities? What's going to happen in terms of graduate employment support? You know, I mean, it's no wonder, to be honest, we don't have more students suffering with mental health problems when you look at the catalogue of uncertainty. And this has all come from a government that's failed to grasp the situation and failed to put an adequate plan in. Already we should be thinking ahead, saying, right, how are we going to ensure students have the skills and competencies needed to enter the job market? Where is the graduate employment support for students? They've talked about Kickstarter, they've talked about the support for other groups. Where is the support for students out there. And instead, we've seen these lazy attacks on student unions, these lazy attacks around free speech, instead of really looking at the incredible work student unions are doing in connecting people and stopping that social isolation. And one thing I've seen some fantastic labour groups doing around the country is actually working as a group to reach out to other people and bring people together to combat that loneliness and isolation. And I think one way so people, talk about a feeling of dealing with mental health problems is giving people that greater sense of control and giving them a more sense of choice. And they're the two things that have been taken away from students through this pandemic. The choice has gone. They've been told when to go home, when to return to university, where they can study. And also the feeling of control has gone. Nobody knows how the assessments are going to be done this year. Nobody knows how you're going to complete your courses. So I mean, this failure on leadership is no doubt driving the mental health problems. And in response to this, the government are going to set up another task force, which to me feels like kicking the can further down the road, not coming up with any solutions. And what they've invested a couple of million on an online platform. Well, the online platform's okay and are not doing down the people who are involved in it, but an online platform is not going to deal with the financial concerns, the control concerns, the choice concerns, the long-term employment concerns that students have. So, all I can say is we're here, we're on your side, very, very happy to talk to you. I know some universities have done an amazing job, and I do want to highlight, I know there's been some brilliant work done by some vice chancellors out there, but I think there's also, I think it's fair to say, it's been a mixed bag. So yes, please let us know what further we can do to go in there and hopefully knock some heads together and get some sensible decisions made for students.
Thank you. That's really great. I think what you touched on, where students kind of feel like they've lost control, like they've been told when to come back to uni, when to go home, but then they've sort of been told, come back now, and then once they're all back, oh, we're not going to give you any rent decreases and you're going to all be online. Like, I think it's been quite disgusting, to be honest. So Kira, so you're our last panel member and only student that I'm aware of, I'm guessing. So how has the pandemic impacted your mental health? Like, if you give us more of like a personal experience, if that's all right.
Yeah, definitely. So just on me, so I'm King's College London Labour's disability officer. I'm a disabled student. I've suffered from mental health problems most of my life, which I've been quite open about. To me, it's quite an important part of my life and my experiences and the way that the world shapes around me, like my anxiety, and the way that relates to my education has always been something I found quite important. Didn't think I'd get good enough A-levels to get in, I had to struggle through that, get proper provision now to come to university, and I've had to fight tooth and nail to get any sort of support again. In my day job, I'm also an exams officer, an exams invigilator for BTEC exams in FE College in London. So because the government hasn't unilaterally cancelled BTEC exams, I'm still going in day to day, sitting with students who are quite frankly terrified to be in the room with me, because I have to, see groups of 10 to 15 students at a time, sit them down, get their papers ready. Because of that, I caught coronavirus just over a month and a half ago at work, as did all the rest of my office. So having that extra layer of stress and worry as well. As Cindy was talking about just now, about having students having to work to sort of keep up with our maintenance loan costs, that's my job. I can't quit because I can't afford my rent otherwise. So it's sort of a self-perpetuating problem, and sort of seeing their worries as well, something that has really sort of fueled my anger of how students have been treated in this crisis, from universities to schools to FE students. I just said that the situation really has been worse than ever, and unfortunately most universities haven't really plugged in an extra mental health support. What we had last year with our safety net at King's College and much better mitigating circumstances, the university is planning to not put in place this year. So whereas in my second year we had the safety net regulations, now in my third year looking to graduate, quite worried about my dissertation, not being able to access libraries and the expensive books, which I've totaled up to be about £500 worth of books. I can't access those. And they're also then saying I'm not going to get an academic safety net support. So that in itself is a huge worry. I know lots of students share the same, especially those on practical courses who can't access the very expensive equipment and information they're going to need to get on with their degree. On top of this, we have our accommodation fees, and as I said, very few student employment options. I consider myself incredibly lucky to still be in employment, but it is a 0 hours contract. So you never know week to week. If the government do cancel exams, maybe I won't get any more work. If they don't cancel exams, maybe I'll get coronavirus again. So that's sort of like the cycle that we're in with this. I'm also in private accommodation, so complete solidarity with students in halls, organising for rent strikes. King's has some of the most expensive accommodation in London, and some of the worst bursary support for low-income students too. So our combination of that is quite difficult. I'm also in private accommodation, so if contracts do get cancelled, I'll still be having to pay long after I graduate, especially in this environment. That's obviously quite stressful too. So on top of all of this, people were obviously given an ultimatum last month: risk going home and see your family for Christmas, risk taking coronavirus with you, and risk having nowhere safe to study at home for the next term. And if I went back and studied at home during this term, I'd be working on the dining room table with my brother doing his GCSEs, so that wasn't a suitable option for me, but of course we went into lockdown anyway. And then if you don't go home, then of course you got to take the risk of continuing to be alone. Most people have been alone for extensive amounts of time over the past few weeks and months. I've read testimonials for King's students in first year, comparing it to being in prison or in prison-like situations where you're not allowed out, you can't see anyone, you're being treated like you've done something wrong by staff when you do try and go out. And all of this continuing to incur further costs that your maintenance loan may not necessarily stretch. So on top of all this, rising short-term debt, whether it's credit unions, buy now, pay later schemes like Klarna. I know personally I've got myself into a hole because of it, but we have no choice. We have to pay what comes up, whether it's our bills, our phone bill, to be able to get internet, to do our courses, whether it's to pay our rent or just day-to-day things like food and clothing. Students really do have very few options. I know personally from applying to the emergency finance for low-income students at my university, the first time round I had a 4-week wait before I got an answer. By that point, the situation was long overdue and I was well into a hole that I shouldn't have been in. So I think there's a lot to be done to fight for students, and there's many multi-layered issues that are contributing to our rising mental health challenges. You know, I mentioned my anxiety was a problem for me at the beginning of this crisis. What it is now is not just a problem, it's just part of my everyday life. Going to work, going to the shops, having to worry about coursework deadlines, and all at the same time trying to get everything done and ready to graduate in June, which in itself is a big and overwhelming problem as to what happens then. So I am pleased that our party and people like Kate, Emma and Rosena are taking these issues seriously and are acutely aware of them. And absolutely, our lives and our situations at university have not been what we've expected. But on top of all that, it's been the complete opposite, where students have been trapped in situations that no one will want to be put in regularly. So happy to answer any questions and sort of give more of a personal bit from this, and also sort of give some of the testimonials that I've heard and people have allowed me to share as disability officer too. So thank you so much for having me.
That's great. Thanks, Kira. So if we go to the first question, if that's all right, I know that you might not have time to answer, Rosena, but if we just ask a question, then maybe if you have time to say like a couple of words. So the first question we had is, as elected MPs, can you commit to campaign for a reduction in tuition fees to help us all cope during these tough times? Mental health can be really damaged by financial worries, and I know dozens of fellow students personally have seen hundreds online who believe our tuition fee should be placed in line with that of the Open University because this reflects the standard of teaching that we are receiving.
So shall I start on that one? So I think we've really got, I was really interested in listening to Kira and it was very, very powerful. And I think we've got to separate out things that are very difficult to, that everybody's facing, are very difficult to deal with, and we have to have some coping strategies. So things like isolation, about feeling anxious when we go to the shops. These things are intrinsic to the way that the epidemic is affecting all of us. And we need coping strategies, all of us, including good mental health services and support, to make people feel confident and secure in very, very insecure and frightening times. Separate that out from where policy decisions are actively damaging, and we could make better decisions to mitigate some of the effects that are going to be intrinsic to what's happening to all of us, just because there is a raging pandemic all around us, and it's of necessity curtailing our lives and creating this anxiety and stress, especially when you compound that with the experience that students have, the extra pressures students have, your academic studies, isolation if you're away from home, and your support networks, not getting the university experience you expected, and so on. When it comes to financial worries, I think To be honest, there are a number of really complicated issues here. And I can see later on there's a question about rents as well. We think it's really unjust that students are paying rent for properties that you've been told you can't occupy. We are concerned about the quality of the student experience and the teaching and learning experience you're having, and whether you're getting value for money. We recognise that universities too are in a very difficult position. They haven't set up the situation to look like this, and there are financial consequences for them too. Many are really doing their best now to help with cancelling accommodation costs where it's their own accommodation, help with hardship payments where they can, but clearly not all universities are in the same financial position to do that. And in relation to the online teaching and learning, I think it's difficult to say, well, it should be just like the Open University, because it's bigger than that. It's about the whole student experience. And the Open University experience and offer is a different kind of proposition from the kind of proposition that you would have if you were going to go off for a 3-year study at university. That's the main thing you'd be doing. You might work part-time to support yourself, but your study is the thing that you're really doing with this part of your life. Our colleagues in the all-party parliamentary group on universities are looking at the way in which we could best design as a financial model that is fair to students and recognises that the fees you've paid for your studies aren't actually commensurate with what you thought you were going to get, not just in terms of teaching and learning, but as part of the whole university experience. And of course, I would say that, to be honest, the reality is that this is debt that often doesn't get paid anyway. So there's a bigger psychological impact, I think, even in normal times for students about this structure of having a burden of debt. And that, you start your working life with that, and it looks like many, many years of a debt sentence, and beginning to think about how we cope with the mental effects of that on students too. I think there's more thinking to be done, to be honest, about how we respond to the different aspects of this question about fees and treating students fairly, and making sure not just that we think about this for this year and this crisis, but there's a much bigger question about, as Emma says, the fact that we had a commitment in our last manifesto that we think that the student loans model is really not working at all, and in fact the whole marketisation of the sector is not working at all. So I think you raise a really, really important question there, but it doesn't have a really, really simple set of drivers or a really simple answer, and that's what we're trying to think about with colleagues in Parliament in the Shadow Education team.
Thank you. That was fantastic. I think it's interesting what you say about the mental impact about having this debt over your head, even if it's not necessarily something that you're actively paying in a direct way. Because I don't know whether this was a universal experience, but Student Finance England updated their website recently so that when you log on, one of the first things you see and one of the main things you see on the page is actually a total of the amount of money that you owe. Which is a bit off-putting quite often when you're trying to apply for student finance and you see, £50,000, whatever. So thank you, that's fantastic. What I'll do is I'll move on to another question, and it will be open to anyone in the panel to answer. But before I do that, Rosena, are you in a situation where you need to head off now?
I've just let them know I'll be a few minutes late. So if you wanted to ask a more mental health related question, I'll be super happy to do that.
Yeah, that's fine. I believe I saw one in the chat that was actually for you specifically, so I'll scroll up to that. Yeah. So it says it's from Brandon Fitzgerald. As you mentioned, Rosena, having supportive people around you can be massively helpful during times of mental ill health. What can we do to ensure universities have the support in place at all times and not just during a pandemic?
Brilliant. Thank you, Brandon. And firstly, before I answer that, I just want to say thank you to Kira for sharing your personal experiences, because that's not easy to do in a forum like this. So thank you. I think it is hugely important that when we talk about student mental health, we look at it obviously through the lens of this pandemic, but acknowledge that it's a problem more broadly at the best of times. I know that I hear from so many students who have suffered with their mental health, and when they go to their GP, they're told, look, you're just at an incredibly stressful university, it's tough being 19 or 20, kind of, move on, get over it. And that, quite frankly, doesn't cut it. We also know that 1 in 4 of all people suffer with depression, and that's particularly prevalent in students who tend to be, quite high academic achievers, push themselves. And I think one thing that has come out of this whole COVID experience, there have been lots of really terrible things, but one of the really positive things that has come out is some of the truly exceptional things that have been put in place in different universities for how peer support can work. And I know that actually when I think it was with King's, we spoke about this, and also with a couple of other universities. Yeah, Kira's nodding because she was on that call as well. But we talked about like a buddying system. And I think that there are things that have been adopted in certain places throughout this pandemic that should, quite frankly, stay. I also think it's this pandemic has laid bare some of the issues that have always been prevalent in our student body but never spoken about. And I think we need to build on that when we come out of this pandemic. So some of the things I would like to see are improved training for mental health practitioners and local GPs who have to deal with students. I would also like to see buddying systems set up for people and real safe spaces for people to be able to talk about suffering with their mental health. And I just really think it's important that we take the opportunities out of this. And I think also we have a role as politicians to make it easier as well for universities to do their job. I always believe fundamentally 99.9% of people are good and want to do the right thing. And I believe that that is so true for universities as well. And I think the way to do that is to involve students in the decision-making process and ask them, what do you need from us? How can we help you? Because I believe the will is there, I believe the need is there, and it's about what can we do to join those two together.
That's great, thank you. I think public consultation is a huge issue in policy making in every area, but I think especially with students, we just kind of get ignored and they decide what happens to us without any real experience of it. So I had a question from Alexander. Given that first year is usually the year in which people socialise the most, do you think there'll be any long-term effects on current first year students' mental health due to the lack of friendships being made, thus perpetuating the isolation experienced at the moment? And do you think this could also impact their long-term health and academic performance? And if so, what do you think we could do to be mitigating this? If you want to take that again, Rosena, if you have to rush off after that.
Thanks. I'm so sorry. I'm really sorry. I'm not trying to hog it all. Oh my gosh, first year uni, it was so messy in the funnest of ways, isn't it? But I'm always perpetually hopeful. This pandemic will end. It really will end. And the university experience is a 3 or 4 year experience, or if you're the perpetual student like me, it can be even longer. And I do think we have to remain hopeful. And yes, of course, first year is that time where we make friendships and we have really fun experiences. But I honestly believe, I know it's so hard not being able to have those experiences now, but there will come a time when everyone can make up for lost time. As to the ongoing mental health effects, yes, I think it's deeply difficult to go somewhere new, think you're starting this whole new chapter of your life, and then you're finding yourself feeling incredibly isolated. There are some people who would take to that really well, it just wouldn't bother them, and there are other people who would find that incredibly difficult and isolating, and for them would impact their whole experience. And I do think that's why it's so important that we make sure that we take these messages to the government in the way that we already have and say, look, what is your plan for helping universities and supporting universities to support these students? And I think the first year, it's particularly difficult if you're in places where that year counts for a significant part of your overall grade. Like for me, I'm somebody that crams at the last minute and always sort of waits till the end to do anything useful. But if your first year is a year where a third of your whole degree is based on that year, I think there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. There has to be consideration taken into account with regards to how those assessments will take place, whether or not there's any room to discount the first year assessments and put it on second and third or fourth year later on. But there has to be a discussion there, because I think we do absolutely have to acknowledge that that people whose mental health is impacted do need to have the support that they need in place in order to continue their degree and fulfill their potential. But we just have to remain hopeful. It's so important that we remain hopeful, and we will get out of the other side. And I'd just like to leave sort of my sort of last point being on that. And the fact that we are all here together this evening means we're all invested in mental health. We're all invested in getting it right for our students and young people. And I'm so enthusiastic about the fact that if we continue this dialogue and get out of the other side, we will be able to party again. We will be able to have those nights out in the Students' Union, and we will be able to go on and fulfill our potential as young people. But I know it's a really daunting time, but you're doing amazingly. It's okay not to feel okay. Help is out there if you need it, and hang in there. We will get out of this the other side.
Amazing, thank you.
I'm gonna say goodbye now. I'm so sorry, and thank you, Emma and Kate as well, and Kira and Amy and Ben. And it's just lovely to be here. Hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
So is it okay, Emma, if I open that question up to you as well? I can repeat it if you've kind of forgotten what the initial question was.
No, it's cool. I can see it in the group chat, and I do think at this moment it's important to acknowledge that students are not one homogenous group. Not everybody is living away from home. Not everybody is in halls of residence. Not everybody is between the ages of 18 and 22, 23. And I do think that sometimes when decisions are made, often the commuter students are forgotten, or the students with caring responsibilities, or the part-time students, or the mature students. And I think the pandemic has impacted them in a just slightly different way, because I was speaking to one student who was an amazing young woman who was also a carer for her mum, and was used to going home at weekends to go and check on her mum and have those caring responsibilities, and then be away at university. And they'd arranged that she'd go home, I think it was every fortnight. When coronavirus hit, she wasn't able to, so she was left with this feeling of immense guilt for not being able to go home and visit her mum, who she had these caring responsibilities for, because she wasn't allowed to. And it comes back to this control and choice, which is something that's been taken away from all students. And on the issue of socialisation, I think this is where the student unions are crucially important, and where I do get quite frustrated with government and the sort of lazy attacks on student unions I've mentioned before, because it has been in many occasions the student unions that have gone out there and tried to sort of mix students together and offer a form of socialisation. As for the long-term effect, I think that really depends on what's going to happen in the next 6 to 12 months. I'm really concerned about dropout rates, really deeply concerned about that, and where we're going to see these in the demographics of students that are going to be impacted, and whether those students will ever be convinced to return to university after having a poor experience. But let's think positively. I'm going to channel Rosena here, because she's always positive about everything, and say, yes, we will come out, this pandemic will end, and those opportunities will be there. And I think rather than the government attacking student unions, what we should be saying to student unions is, how can we, if we were in government, a Labour government, support you in organising as many social interactive opportunities for students to get together? How can we support all the societies that are out there? How can we offer that enrichment that people have when they go away to university? And I'm slightly concerned that in the upcoming higher education strategy document that's coming out from government, what we'll instead see is attacking student unions, and that will be obviously met with huge resistance by the Labour Party, because they have this impact, this crucial impact to play. And on your point, Alex, and great question by the way, about affecting academic performance, well, I think it's, you'd assume everyone would understand the link between mental health and academic performance. People are struggling with their mental health, and of course it's going to impact their academic performance. And I've seen lots of comments about the no detriment policies, and it's difficult to assume that universities would not take into account the incredibly difficult year that students had faced. I mean, if you can't put as a mitigating circumstance survived a pandemic, I'm not quite sure what you can use as a legitimate excuse for mitigating circumstances. I mean, goodness me. So as for the long-term impact, I think it's quite difficult to see. But this will end, as Rosena said, this will end, and let's be looking at what we can do. And I think, as I said before, Labour groups really have a role to play in offering that social interaction that people really need and really want.
Thank you, that was fantastic as always. We're a little bit pressed for time, just spotted it. So what I will do is I will move on to a related question, a very good related question from Matt Edwards. And I'll open it up to anyone in the panel who wants to respond or add a contribution, and we'll just go in turn. So Matt asks, despite some adaptations from universities, many students feel deadlines of workload requirements are too inflexible. Many students feel unable to work and meet coursework with assignment deadlines at the current crisis, and this obviously adds significantly to mental health challenges. So kind of related to what you were finishing off with there, how can assessments be adjusted to allow students the flexibility and compassion that they need during this crisis? And that's open to anyone.
Just very quickly, so I submitted a mitigating circumstance for an essay I had due in before Christmas. This was around the time I said that I got coronavirus. Someone in my house unfortunately had a more adverse reaction, therefore I had to take on caring responsibilities. They recovered, so I got my first mitigating circumstance. Didn't know how long it would go on for, but I said, back in January, when we're back, I'll submit it. The time that hit, which was a few days ago, I said, look, I think I'm going to need an extra extension. I just haven't had the time to sit down and do this because of caring responsibilities, recovering myself, also having to get over the emotional side of not being able to see my family for Christmas the first time. So my family back home being in hospital, we're quite elderly, a whole sort of range of situations that in any other circumstance, you get another mitigating circumstance for. They said, no, because pandemic, these things, will keep going on. You really should submit it for this first circumstance that you got given the new deadline. And so, can I just extend that new deadline just a bit more? And I basically got given a no. So first of all, flexibility over that I think is really important. That no one can plan for what's happening day to day right now. Pandemics aren't something you can plan for. If someone needs 3 or 4 mitigating circumstance forms back to back, they should be able to get those. I know some universities do, some don't. We also have friends in other universities back home in the southwest who've basically just been given, what, my anxiety is just way too high. I can't do this right now. I'm worried about my family. Please give me some circumstance forms. And they've just said no. Again, this is the new normal. What's new normal for one person is not for other people, especially disabled students who are having to take on the extra burden of anxiety and stress around this. So first of all, complete flexibility of mitigating circumstances. I know exams as well are a big worry for some people. I'll be in my 3rd year exams. Because of last year, I've only ever taken 1 exam my entire time at uni, which was my 1 first year exam. So I cancelled last year. I think some flexibility and full planning what we're actually going to get this year is really important. I know some departments have been really sort of evasive on what we will or won't be doing. These decisions need to be made now because I don't see the situation getting much better by April, May. So making sure we know what we're to plan for, whether that's 24-hour exams, 2-day exams, things that are released online, etc., etc. We need to know now so we can have that kind of like compassion and planning and be able to know what we're going to be doing in a few months. And also making sure that when we are submitting things, universities are really in touch with knowing that caring responsibilities, especially grief, is something that students are going through. I think students are seen as this isolated bubble that are shoved away in halls somewhere in cities. Actually, when you're hundreds of miles away from family and having to grieve people that you haven't seen in 6 months because of all this, things can be super delayed. So having an understanding voice at the end of the form as well. So when you send off your form, not just getting the usual standard out of office email and then just thanks received, actually saying how are you doing, can we get in contact with your personal tutor, do you want someone to phone you, just things like this that actually can make compassion around exam time a bit of a higher priority. I think at the moment things in wanting to get things done, things are very automated. And when you're not living on campus, you may not have seen any of your other students or lecturers in person at any point during this year. You may be living alone and then you're sending off a form to an automated system that can impact your mental health too. So yeah, a bit of a ramble. I hope some of that makes sense on those parts.
Yeah, that was fantastic and very, as we said, it's fantastic to have a student voice here. Obviously, most of us in the audience, I'm sure, are students, but to have a fantastic panel member that can offer that perspective is great as well. The same question, I could repeat it if you guys would like, but Kate or Emma, do you have anything you'd like to add, or should we move on?
I think
so
just
difficult.
to say it's pretty horrifying, isn't it, to hear that you've got such a lack of sympathy for what are entirely legitimate circumstances, and it is inevitable in the circumstances that we're living in that people are going to see one thing after another that may impact on their ability to submit assignments and so on. So I'm quite, I think it's surprising to hear that there's so much inflexibility actually, and concerning.
Thanks for that. Sorry, it's so difficult on Zoom because you can't catch anyone's eye to say you go next. So there's this pause, and it's. I think one of the issues seems to be that there's lots of talk in the news about schools and assessments and exams, and that seems to have hit the headlines, but no one's actually talking about, okay, so how are universities going to do their end of year assessments then? How are they going to do their exams? It's not getting the same coverage as schools. Don't really understand the reason, but I think because it's not getting the coverage, it's not moving up the government's agenda, and I'm concerned it's not on Gavin Williamson's agenda at all, that there's this whole problem with final year students who are meant to be sitting exams, and how is that going to happen? How are they going to meet the hours needed by their professional association if they're doing a professional qualification? And to be fair on the universities, they're getting last minute decisions coming through from government all the time that they rapidly have to change. I mean, before the information about the staggered start return in January, universities were left sort of having their plans in limbo, saying, well, we can't announce what our plans are going to be until we get the guidance from government. And the guidance from government didn't come out until later on in December, even though universities were expected then to sort of plan and organise it all ready for January. And they're in a similar situation over assessments. And this feeling of uncertainty and not really sure what's happening, a lack of clarity and no long-term plan, unfortunately, that is trickling down and being filtered down to the students and sitting on their shoulders, and it's not fair. But because the government aren't saying, right, you know, there's no, as they have with schools, there's going to be no examinations at the end of this year, there's going to be a form of teacher assessment, they're saying, well, you know, they've not given any guidance, they've not given any information to universities, so universities aren't there able to pass it on to students. And the whole thing is a total mess because they just leave all their decisions until the last minute. I am shocked, Kira, about the lack of flexibility. I think I've heard better news from other universities, I have to say, over mitigating circumstances. But I think it comes down to that feeling of students not being in control and not being given the choices. And the same, I have to say, when I speak to the UCU, tutors are feeling in a similar way. Tutors in university are left again saying, well, you know, we're not really sure how we're going to do this assessment. We don't know how we're going to evaluate if they've met the professional qualifications because of the pandemic. And this comes back to the point I keep making. Where is the long-term plan? Where is the forward thinking? Where is the integrating and involving students in these conversations? You know, where is the rounded decision making? You know, there's this whole, you know, sorry, I broke my promise, didn't I, not to rant about the government. I do apologise. I'll stop now.
No, it's definitely not a problem. I think we could all rant about the government for quite a few minutes if we were given the chance at the moment. Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. No, thank you for that. What I'll do is I'll move on to a final question. Again, I'll open it to everyone, but to avoid a bit of awkwardness, I'll run through everyone, learn from my mistakes there. This one's from Mia Johnson, and it's a really interesting point that we also haven't really touched on tonight. And it's that we're all making great points about graduate and fresher support. Her younger sister was significantly affected by the A-level results fiasco, and along with many other students her age, she has lost 2 years of college or sixth form to coronavirus. How can we ensure that young people starting university from 2021 onwards are prepared academically and mentally, having missed out on those crucial 2 years beforehand? So I'll start with Kira, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important point. I know that most of my development education came from when I went to college. My level years are really important to me. So I study war studies. For a lot of people, you might not know what that is, but basically it's like conflict development, how war operates on an international level. It's something that King's does quite well. But the reason that my first year was quite certain I only had one exam is because we had basically a HAL-2 year. We had like a how to study war year because obviously no one's done that before. And I think the university is taking a better step in their first year courses. It might mean some removal of flexibility, but actually having modules that are quite set and distinct and how to study your course, I think is really important. you know, if you're going to university and you're being thrown into a history course and gone, you know, just fill in loads of essays, give loads of references to us, is what you need to do. Actually, for some students, their A-level provision in the first place may not have been up to scratch compared to some other courses. You know, the sort of disjointed things, and I think universities assume too much about our knowledge when we get through the doors in the first place. So I think only in third year have I now properly understood how to reference things properly. So that those sort of like basic information points, I think if universities give out a much more standardized course for first years, how to study, what referencing means, what academic language actually means, how do you structure your essays, things that some people might think are really basic, but actually a lot of people might have missed out on during their 16 to 18 years, especially now when we've missed quite a lot during college as well. So I think those would be quite important. I know I would have wanted that having come into the situation, but yeah, definitely like my heart absolutely goes out to students that are starting in the next year or two. I know my brother's leaving year 11 this year and it's absolutely no idea what he's doing, and no idea what his GCSEs won't look like. So I know and understand that stress, but I think university is prepping much more for how to understand knowledge as well as actually being able to understand what you think about ideas. Those things are equally important and can sort of really help your education later on anyway. So yeah, I'd say that'd be quite a useful tool for some students, I think.
Fantastic, thank you. Yeah, everything you said, completely correct. Kate, would you like to respond to that?
So I think the first thing that universities will need to do is have a longer term plan than just what are they going to do this September. They've got to recognise that this is a series of cohorts of incoming students who've had their studies disrupted. So we don't just need a 1-year plan for this, we're going to need a plan over several years, both to support students who might arrive in September this year, but who will have the whole of their university studies impacted by the disruption that they experienced before they came to university, but also next year's students, and that will have a 3-year, they'll have a 3 or 4 year impact to contend with. So, and it's even conceivable that students joining even later on could be impacted as well by the experience of COVID over last year and this year. So I think universities need to see this as a medium to longer term strategy, not just a one-off problem this September that they've got to resolve. Secondly, I think we are already seeing universities thinking about this in terms of their admissions policies, and some universities have said that they are going to reduce their grade requirements to take account of the educational disruption that students have suffered in their year 13 exams. And I think we're really encouraging universities to think about what is a fair way of admitting students that takes account of the disruption to their learning before they come to university. And then when they get there, they are going to need additional support, catch-up support, really, isn't it? Because there will have been lost learning, and that will matter a lot in some subjects where the undergraduate course would have wanted to build from what you should have known as you started the course coming out of school. Different in other subjects. War studies is a really interesting example where it's something nobody has probably studied anything like before, so everybody would be starting without some of the knowledge base. But as you say, Kira, everybody will need catch-up attention in terms of some of the basic tools and techniques of study and of presenting information and so on. And then I think there will be a huge need for mental health support, because it's always quite stressful, I think, for students coming into a new environment, starting their first year at university, perhaps being away from home for the first time, wondering about how they're going to manage their studies, whether they're going to find them interesting, whether they're going to cope with them. And now this is all compounded by having come from a very unstable period during the pandemic. So I think universities are going to have to think a lot, not just about learning support, not just about study support, but they are really going to have to think about well-being and mental health support, some of the things that Rosena was talking about, that really need to be integrated into the offer for students, both students who are already at university this year, but also future cohorts of students who are going to be arriving in September and then in subsequent years.
Brilliant, thank you. Emma, would you like to finish this off?
Yeah, well, I obviously agree with everything that Kate said, the need to plan for it longer than just this year. And this year, universities are already telling me, because of all the chaos over A-levels, they've put in extra study support on some courses. But as Kira said, it really depends on the course that you're studying and the level of acquired knowledge needed. Now, even if there isn't as much chaos as there was last year, because of the way exams are structured this time, or mini exams, or however they complete the assessment, we know that that pupils in school will not have covered as much of the A-level syllabus as pupils in previous years because of the pandemic. I think that's a given. Therefore, their baseline knowledge when they start universities, for some of them, is not going to be as high as previous cohorts. And the universities need to acknowledge this and look at how they're going to do it, because unless you're looking at dropping the professional standards at the end of the university system, then you're going to have to basically cover more in the same period to get everybody up to the required level. Now, you know, the pandemic's not going to disappear. We're going to get vaccinated and hopefully life will return to a semblance of normality. But in terms of getting in those hours for professional qualifications, and that's going to be an ongoing challenge, especially, you know, in the NHS, because our NHS workers are, you know, absolutely on their knees, and the idea that there's suddenly this great capacity to mentor all additional NHS students is I think, frankly, unrealistic. And this comes back to, you know, as Kate said at the beginning, this need for a plan. We need a long-term plan, and this is what, you know, the government need to be thinking about. What's the long-term plan for the sector? How are they going to support the sector? Because otherwise, my fear is we're going to see huge dropout rates at university. So we need to be looking at, and I've even thought about, how can some programs that are out there that already exist, which take students and actually mentor them, not tutor them, mentor them, and offer that mentoring up to the first 2 months when they're away at university. So they kind of keep them going through the summer, and then while they're still there, and help them settle in. And projects where they've done this tend to be charities and organisations. They've had a really high success rate for students, and I think we need to start thinking a little bit more imaginatively about how we're going to support cohorts. As Kate absolutely said, you know, not just this year. This is going to be impacting for the next few years.
Thank you for that. That was really good. So we have run like only just slightly over, but I think this discussion is definitely worth it. Thank you everyone for your contributions, and especially Kara for offering like a personal experience, and everyone who asked questions. They were really good, and they helped us explore the issues a little bit more. I just want to say, I think it's much easier to channel Rosena when we have shadow ministers that engage with the issues really, really well. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that it's actually been really refreshing tonight to hear from you, and to hear that you actually understand what the key issues are, because it's not what we're getting at all from the government at the minute. So this event has made it clear that we can do so much better, and that we wouldn't be seeing as much of a crisis and such an inadequate response if we had a Labour government in power. So yeah, I just want to thank everyone for your contributions.
Thanks so much. And just mention to Lauren, we're going to be doing some virtual events around the country to try and engage with students. So if you send me your details, Lauren, or I'll make sure I sort of try and let you know, because me and Kate were just planning them earlier today. Yeah. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all very much. It's been really good to join the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.